It started with a sealed royal letter quietly delivered through a side entrance at Buckingham Palace, one that senior aides reportedly tried to keep out of public view for nearly 48 hours. But when whispers emerged that Prince William himself had signed the order removing Queen Camilla from several prestigious garden party hosting duties, the silence inside palace corridors turned into panic. What seemed like a minor scheduling adjustment quickly revealed itself to be something far larger, a ruthless power correction already shaking the monarchy from within. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the palace tried to make it sound harmless, a diary adjustment, confrontation for the public to witness, no dramatic announcement from palace steps, no emotional explanation. Instead, there was paper, authority, a signature, the most unforgiving administrative changes that disappear beneath the weight of royal ceremony. But insiders reportedly knew better. This was not a misplaced name on a guest list or a simple correction to the spring calendar. This was a signed internal directive, and according to growing whispers, it carried William's authority with cold precision. For Queen Camilla's circle, the timing felt brutal. Garden parties are not just polite gatherings with tea, handshakes, and smiles. They are a public signal of trust, visibility, and royal standing. To host them is to be seen as a steady hand of the crown. To be removed from them, even partially, is to be quietly pushed away from the center. Reports suggest the decision had been building for weeks, perhaps months. As tensions inside palace operations became harder to conceal, William had allegedly been holding unusually long meetings with senior household officials, the kind of meetings that do not happen unless something serious is moving beneath the surface. Courtiers who once spoke freely became careful. Aides who usually dismissed gossip suddenly refused to answer questions, and when several royal correspondents began hinting at an internal restructuring, the phrase landed like a warning. It sounded clean, official, almost boring. But inside the monarchy, such words can hide a revolution. Camilla's allies were reportedly blindsided not only by the decision itself, but by the sharpness of its execution. There was no grand confrontation for the public to witness, no dramatic announcement from palace steps, no emotional explanation wrapped in royal language. Instead, there was paper, authority, a signature, the most unforgiving weapons of palace power. And that was what made the move so chilling. William did not need noise, he did not need spectacle. He used the machinery of the institution itself. The palace refused direct comment, and that silence only made the story more explosive because in royal life, silence is rarely empty. Sometimes it is protection, sometimes it is strategy, and sometimes it is confirmation without words. By the time the whispers reached beyond palace walls, one question had begun to dominate every private conversation. Why would William act now? And why against Camilla's ceremonial influence? But the real shock wasn't the letter itself. It was the growing belief that William had finally decided the old balance of power inside the monarchy could no longer survive. For decades, royal garden parties were presented as harmless displays of elegance, diplomacy, and tradition. But behind the polished smiles and carefully staged photographs, insiders now claim those events had quietly become one of the monarchy's most strategic arenas of influence. And according to palace whispers, that influence had increasingly centered around Camilla's expanding inner circle. At first, few outside the palace understood why the hosting roles mattered so much. To the public, a garden party looked like ceremony, courtesy, and tradition, stitched neatly into the royal calendar. But inside the monarchy, those invitations carried weight. They revealed who was welcomed close to power, who was placed near the crown, and who was allowed to move through the quiet networks where loyalty is built without speeches. Reports suggest William's concern was not about one afternoon, one guest list, or one appearance. It was about a pattern, a slow expansion, a widening shadow around ceremonial influence that, in his view, had begun to blur the line between royal duty and private advantage. As King Charles' reign settled into its most vulnerable chapter, Camilla's presence naturally grew stronger. She had stood beside him through public scrutiny, personal battles, and the long road toward acceptance. But palace whispers suggest that what began as support gradually became something more complicated. Her circle allegedly became more visible, more confident, and more deeply woven into the social fabric surrounding royal events. For William's camp, that raised a dangerous question. Was the monarchy becoming divided into competing centers of influence, one shaped by the future king and another, still rooted in Camilla's personal orbit? The tension reportedly sharpened around guest selections, hosting influence, and the quiet symbolism of who represented the crown in front of the nation's most honored citizens. These were not random decisions, they were signals. Every handshake, every invitation, every name placed near a royal host carried meaning, and according to insiders, younger royals increasingly felt that their place in the institution's next chapter was being crowded by forces tied to an older arrangement. That fear did not explode all at once. It gathered slowly beneath polite language and controlled smiles until it became impossible to ignore. William allegedly viewed the garden party issue as part of a broader succession problem. The monarchy, in his eyes, could not move into the future if old loyalties kept pulling it backward. The word modernization began appearing in insider commentary, but behind that polished phrase was something far more severe. Modernization meant control. It meant discipline. It meant deciding who carried royal authority, who merely enjoyed its glow, and who had to be quietly moved aside before the next reign began. And once William reportedly concluded that ceremonial influence was becoming political influence, the confrontation behind palace walls became impossible to avoid. The confrontation reportedly unfolded during a closed door strategy session so tense that several aides later described the atmosphere as unusually icy, even by royal standards. Behind those heavy palace doors, discussions about schedules and ceremonial duties allegedly transformed into something far more dangerous, a battle over who truly controls the monarchy's future image. By then, the garden party dispute had already moved beyond simple diary management. William reportedly entered the discussion with a clear belief that long standing arrangements could no longer be protected simply because they were familiar. For years, royal households had survived by avoiding open conflict, smoothing over private resentment with public politeness. But this time, insiders claimed the future king was not asking for another compromise. He was challenging the structure itself. He allegedly questioned why certain hosting duties remained attached to Camilla's circle when the monarchy was supposed to be moving toward a cleaner, more disciplined future. Camilla's supporters reportedly pushed back immediately. To them, any reduction in her role looked like humiliation dressed up as reform. They allegedly argued that she had earned her place through years of loyalty to Charles, through public duty, and through the difficult transformation from controversial figure to crowned consort. But William's side saw the issue differently. This was not about punishing the queen, it was about stopping ceremonial authority from becoming a private shield. And once that argument entered the room, the mood reportedly hardened. Sources claim King Charles appeared exhausted, caught between loyalty to his wife and the rising force of his heir. That was the tragedy at the heart of the meeting. Charles had spent decades fighting for Camilla's acceptance, yet now he was facing a son who believed the monarchy's survival required boundaries even the queen could not cross. Senior household figures were divided. Some feared William was moving too quickly, risking a family wound that could spill into public view. Others believed delay would be more dangerous, allowing hidden tensions to grow until the institution looked weak. The phrase streamlining the monarchy reportedly dominated the discussion, but beneath that careful language was a far sharper meaning. Streamlining meant removal, it meant limiting influence, it meant separating personal loyalty from public duty. Insiders whisper that William invoked duty, stability, and public trust with a firmness that left little room for retreat. He allegedly argued that the crown could not afford competing loyalties at the very moment the nation was watching for signs of strength, and shortly after that meeting ended. The signed letter was allegedly finalized quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Yet the impact was thunderous because a document can sometimes do what arguments cannot. It can turn private warning into official action. But while aides tried to present the decision as administrative, Palace insiders increasingly believed it carried a far more personal message aimed directly at Camilla herself. By the following morning, reports suggest frantic calls were already moving between Clarence House advisors, royal household staff, and longtime social allies connected to Camilla's network. What had once appeared to be an untouchable position inside palace ceremonial life suddenly looked alarmingly fragile, and insiders claimed the panic spreading through her circle was immediate. The first reaction, according to palace whispers, was denial. Camilla's allies reportedly tried to frame the move as routine, a simple adjustment to responsibilities, nothing more than calendar discipline in a busy royal season. But the harder they tried to soften the meaning, the louder the silence around them became, because everyone inside that world understood the truth. Royal roles are rarely reduced by accident. When a name disappears from a key ceremonial position, it is not just a scheduling change, it is a signal, and this signal had William's fingerprints all over it. Royal commentators soon began asking whether this was the beginning of something deeper. Was it only about garden parties, or was it the first visible crack in a much wider restructuring? Claims quickly emerged that several future appearances connected to Camilla's ceremonial influence might also be reviewed. Nothing was announced openly, nothing was confirmed with harsh language. But that was exactly what made the moment so dangerous. The palace did not need to shout, it only needed to move one piece on the board, and suddenly every other piece looked vulnerable. William's allies allegedly framed the decision as institution first, a phrase that sounded calm but carried a ruthless edge. It suggested that personal feelings, private loyalties, and old promises could no longer outweigh the survival of the crown. For Camilla's circle, that framing was devastating. It turned their defense into a weakness. Any objection could be made to look like resistance to reform. Any complaint could be painted as personal ambition standing in the way of royal duty. That was the genius of the move and also its cruelty. Then came the phrase insiders could not stop repeating the heir's accord, whether formal or whispered, real or symbolic. It reportedly captured the mood of the future monarchy closing ranks. William was no longer being described merely as the Prince of Wales waiting for his time. He was being discussed as an active force shaping the institution before the crown ever touched his head. Palace staff were allegedly instructed to avoid speaking about internal tensions, but public curiosity had already exploded online. Every silence became a clue, every absence became a warning, every restrained answer from palace sources fed the belief that something irreversible had begun. And beneath all the noise, Camilla's circle faced the most painful realization of all. Influence that once seemed secure could be withdrawn with one letter, one signature, and one future king deciding the old rules were finished. But the deeper this story spread through royal circles, the clearer it became that the battle was no longer just about garden parties, it was about succession, symbolism, and survival. What shocked many observers wasn't simply that Prince William acted, it was how calculated, disciplined, and strategically timed the move appeared to be. According to multiple royal insiders, this was not an emotional reaction or isolated disagreement. It was allegedly part of a much larger campaign quietly unfolding behind palace walls for months. By the time the letter surfaced in whispers, William's strategy already seemed to have a shape. Reports suggest he had been building a tighter operational structure around the future monarchy, one designed to leave less room for confusion, rivalry, or private influence. Hiding behind tradition to outsiders, it may have looked like a son stepping into a dispute over ceremonial duties, but to those watching closely, it looked more like a future king, testing the levers of power before the throne formally became his. That was what made the moment so unsettling. William was no longer waiting silently in the background, he was moving. Media commentary began filling with references to a leaner royal image, but the phrase carried more weight than it first appeared. Leaner meant fewer distractions, fewer competing voices, fewer unofficial circles shaping the image of the crown. It meant a monarchy stripped down to duty, discipline, and clear public purpose. And in that sharper version of the future, Camilla's informal influence reportedly became harder to justify. The old palace habit of allowing personal networks to drift around royal events was now being treated as a vulnerability. Privately, Catherine was allegedly playing the role she has so often been assigned in moments of royal pressure, steadying the room without dominating. Insight to suggest she did not need to raise her voice to be effective. Her influence came through calm, through restraint, through the quiet reminder that the monarchy's future must look stable, not fractured. For William, that stability mattered deeply. He reportedly wanted clearer hierarchy before the eventual transition, because any uncertainty left unresolved now could explode later when the pressure became even greater. Charles, meanwhile, was said to be caught in a painful bind. Loyalty pulled him toward Camilla, the woman he had defended for decades. Institutional pressure pulled him toward William, the heir who represented the monarchy's next survival test. That tension gave the story its emotional force. This was not simply ambition confronting resistance, it was past and future pressing against each other, while a weakened king stood between them. As discussion grew around future proofing the monarchy's public image, some aides reportedly feared the strategy could open deeper fractures inside the household, but public support, according to palace watchers, appeared to shift to William's decisiveness. Many saw him not as reckless, but necessary, a prince willing to cut through old comforts before they became permanent damage. And as the palace struggled to contain the fallout, many insiders began asking the same unsettling question. Was this merely the first move in a much larger royal purge? Then came the silence, no denial, no clarification, no carefully crafted palace reassurance designed to calm speculation. And inside the world of royal protocol, insiders know silence can sometimes speak louder than any official statement ever could. For Buckingham Palace, silence is often a shield. It allows a storm to burn itself out without feeding it fresh oxygen, but this time, the quiet did not calm the rumors, it sharpened them. The refusal to directly address the claims made the alleged letter feel even more powerful, as if the institution itself had decided that explaining the move would only reveal how serious it truly was. And for Camilla's circle, that silence must have felt like abandonment. If the palace wanted to defend her position, why not say so? If the story was false, why not crush it immediately? The absence of answers became its own kind of verdict. Royal correspondents quickly began reading the quiet as strategically significant. Every careful phrase, every non committal response, every refusal to elaborate seemed to point toward a deeper unease inside the household. Social media speculation intensified dramatically, with public attention turning not only toward Camilla's removed duties, but toward the larger question of who now controlled ceremonial authority. Was Charles still the final voice on every matter, or had William begun shaping decisions from the future king's seat before the transition had even arrived? William's camp allegedly refused to leak additional details, and that restraint only strengthened the impression of discipline. There was no victory lap, no emotional briefing, no public attempt to humiliate Camilla further. Instead, there was control. A cold, deliberate quiet that suggested the move had been made, the message delivered, and the consequences left for others to absorb. Insiders claimed senior staff feared that more internal documents could surface if the dispute continued spreading, and that fear reportedly deepened the caution around every palace response. Commentators began comparing the moment to past royal power struggles when influence shifted not through open rebellion, but through small decisions that later proved historic. A guest list altered, a duty reassigned, a title withheld, a letter signed in the monarchy. The most dramatic changes often arrive dressed as administration. That was why public fascination kept growing. People sensed that this was not only about Camilla, it was about the hidden machinery of power, the quiet transfer of command, and the question every royal household eventually faces: who speaks for the crown when the crown itself is under strain behind palace walls? Tensions reportedly remained unresolved. No public fracture appeared, but the private wound had not closed. The silence protected the monarchy from open scandal. Yet it also confirmed that something delicate had been disturbed. But even as the palace tried to project unity to the outside world, insiders whispered that the monarchy had already crossed a line from which there may be no easy return. At the center of the storm stood King Charles III, physically weakened, politically cornered, and reportedly trapped between two competing forces inside his own monarchy. On one side stood Camilla and the loyalists who helped rebuild his public image for decades. On the other stood Prince William, the future king, increasingly determined to reshape the institution before inheriting it. For Charles, this was more than an administrative dispute. It was personal, painful, and dangerously symbolic. Camilla had been the woman he fought to protect through years of public judgment, private pressure, and royal resistance. Her place beside him had once represented victory after decades of humiliation. Yet now, according to palace whispers, that same position was being quietly tested by the very heir who would one day carry the crown forward. Charles reportedly wanted balance. He wanted calm. He wanted the old royal skill of compromise to save everyone from embarrassment. But balance becomes impossible when both sides believe the future is at stake. Sources claim William refused to reverse the decision. That refusal mattered. It showed that this was not a warning shot meant to frighten Camilla's circle before returning to business as usual. It was a line drawn with intention. For Camilla, the move allegedly felt deeply humiliating because it struck at ceremonial identity, not just responsibility. Hosting roles had given her visibility, rhythm, and proof that she remained central to palace life. To lose them, even partly, was to feel the ground shift under her feet. Senior courtiers reportedly feared the beginning of long-term factional divides inside the monarchy, not loud divisions, not open warfare, something colder. The kind of split that hides beneath official smiles and carefully worded diary notes, growing sharper with every future appearance, every invitation, every absence. William supporters argued that decisive leadership was necessary now, before uncertainty hardened into crisis. They believed the monarchy could not afford two emotional centers of gravity, one tied to Charles's past and one tied to William's future. That is why they situation increasingly became framed as part of a transition era. The phrase sounded gentle, but its meaning was ruthless. Transition meant the old order was being measured. It meant influence was being reviewed. It meant the future king was no longer simply preparing, he was intervening. Questions began to grow around future ceremonial appearances, around who would host, who would represent, and who would quietly step back. Every upcoming duty suddenly carried hidden meaning. Royal insiders described the atmosphere as colder than ever before, not because voices were raised, but because restraint had become the language of conflict. Charles stood between loyalty and survival, Camilla between dignity and displacement, William between obedience and destiny. And in that pressure, the monarchy's polished surface began to feel almost fragile. And while the public only saw polished smiles and formal appearances, insiders claimed the real war for the monarchy's future had already begun behind closed doors. What began as whispers surrounding a single signed letter has now reportedly evolved into something much bigger, a dramatic reordering of influence inside the House of Windsor itself. And according to palace insiders, Prince William's message could not have been clearer. The future monarchy will operate under entirely different rules. By this stage, the Garden Party decision no longer looked isolated. It looked like a symbol, a warning, a first public sign that William was reportedly establishing stronger control over the machinery that will one day define his reign. Inside the palace, power rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives through duties reassigned, names removed, invitations reviewed, and roles quietly narrowed until everyone understands the message without needing it spoken aloud. That was why this letter mattered. It was not only about who stood at a royal gathering, it was about who would be allowed to shape the crown's image in the years ahead. The monarchy now appeared increasingly divided between the old guard and future leadership. On one side stood those who believed the arrangements of Charles's reign should be protected out of loyalty, history, and personal debt. On the other stood William and Catherine, increasingly presented by supporters as the stabilizing future of the institution, disciplined, focused, and unwilling to let private influence blur public duty. Their strength came not from noise, but from restraint. And in the world of royalty, restraint can be more powerful than open confrontation. For Camilla, the alleged limitations on her influence marked a painful turn. What had once seemed secure now looked conditional. Her supporters could argue tradition, loyalty, and service, but William's camp allegedly answered with one colder argument: the institution comes first. That phrase cut through every emotional defense. It left little room for sentiment. It suggested that even a queen consort's role could be measured, reduced, and reshaped if the future of the monarchy demanded it. Charles reportedly understood that painful reality more clearly than anyone. He may have wanted peace, but peace without control can become weakness, and so Palace whispers suggest he began prioritizing institutional survival above personal loyalties, not because the choice was easy, but because the crown has always demanded sacrifice from those closest to it. Royal commentators describe the moment as a defining transition point, the kind that may only be fully understood years later when historians look back and see the signed letter not as a scheduling order, but as the beginning of a new royal era. Because in the end, insiders whisper that this was never really about a garden party at all. It was about who will ultimately define the monarchy's next generation. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.